The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Summer music festivals are back. So to celebrate all this July, the Agenda in the Summer revisits conversations with a diverse cast of musicians and music experts. Tonight, Steve Paikin's 2020 discussion on Canadian music's new boldness.
The Canadian music scene lost several greats over the past few years. Leonard Cohen, the tragically hip's Gord Downie, and most recently Rush's Neil Peart, to name just a few. That prompted much reflection on how such stars help define a Canadian identity. Now, a younger generation is topping charts around the globe and making no apologies for its stardom. Is this group emblematic of a change in the Canadian identity, too? Let's figure that out with, in New York, freelance music journalist John Deckel. And here in our studio, Kiana Rooks Eastman, music executive and CEO of Sandbox Studios. Alan Cross, music journalist and host of the radio program, The Ongoing History of New Music. That's on Toronto FM radio station 102.1 The Edge. And Aaron Ashley is here, hip-hop editor of Exclaim magazine, and we're delighted to have everybody around this table, and John, to you in New York City for this conversation today. I gave the list of some of those who we have just lost in the past few years, and I want to know from you what you think this country lost as a result of their deaths.
Well, these are three towering figures in Canadian music. Neil Peart was the guy that made me want to get into music and play drums. Gord Downie was the national symbol and conscience. Leonard Cohen was our great poet laureate for many years. So to lose three big people like that is a blow to the Canadian music industry, but at the same time, we have a lot of people coming up that will perhaps one day rank alongside them.
We shall come back to that in a moment. I'd like to get your take on that because you are not of Leonard Cohen's generation.
I am not.
You're not of Neil Peart's generation, and yet, how do you regard their departures?
I can understand how important they were to the Canadian industry, absolutely. But at the same time, I'm a child of immigrants. We did not listen to that music growing up in my household. So my relationship to that music is completely different than maybe the general Canadian landscape overall.
John, how would you answer the question?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a change of the guard situation, a sunrise, sunset. It's allowing a new generation to have their Canadian heroes, so to speak, and really to put a new face on Canadian music to the rest of the world as well.
Now, if I can pick up on John's expression about a changing of the guard, and Kiana, I'll bring you in at this point, we have a lot of, well, you want to call them new international superstars on the scene. We got Drake, we got The Weeknd, we got Alessia Cara. I mean, the list goes on. They are unapologetically more out there than these other guys. How do you regard it?
I think that there's a couple of things that are happening at the same time. One, the world is more out there. We live in a social media world where, you can see everything that's happening. Before, you didn't know if Diana Ross was like eating today, like if she went to Chipotle or something like, but now you have the opportunity.
I can't imagine Diana Ross at Chipotle.
Well, to Chipotle.
Okay.
Right about
But
that.
now we can see everything. So I think that the two things that are happening is that we have mega stars from Boy Wonder, who, is winning a ton of producer awards, to Party Next Door, who's a really well-regarded writer, to 1985. Even the people behind the scenes in music right now are writing for some of the biggest stars in the world. So, this idea of modesty changing, I think, people forget that urban music as well comes from a place of bravado, right? It was a place of, I need to be seen, I want to be seen.
I think you described it as braggadociousness.
Like I'm here I am, because urban music typically in when we talked about genres was a disregarded genre, and that is a big part of the reason that I think it's so much more in our face now on the Canadian landscape, because we have some of the biggest urban stars in the world, and urban just transitioned from being its own genre to pop music. It is officially pop music now.
John, let me get your take on that, though, because there is a certain, again, to use Rooksy's word here, there's a certain braggadociousness about this new upcoming or I guess now established generation of Canadian superstars that Anne Murray would not have gone for that kind of thing. Gordon Lightfoot was not out there bragging about how fantastic he was. How's this transition going?
Sure, it's also a bit of recontextualization of what pop music is, as Rooks pointed out. You have to consider what the braggadociousness, if that's a word. You have to kind of put that in the context of hip hop music, and also put what Gord Downie did in the context of kind of localization of rock music. The way that both consider authenticity is a little different. So when you look at someone, since I'm in New York, I'm going to perhaps bring up the Velvet Underground, which in rock was a very, very specific band. They spoke about New York, and that lent them an air of authenticity. But I don't, it would be very hard to consider them a pop band per se. Whereas someone like Drake, that kind of taking his city on his back is considered a good thing, and it allows him to speak to a larger audience. So putting that all in context and coaching it in that idea, you get a different sense of what is possible in terms of kind of taking your city on your back or taking your country on your back and saying, yes, I'm from this place, yes, this place is great, and everybody should come to me rather than me pretending I'm from New York.
Alan.
There was always a big deal about rock bands selling out, selling out their art. With hip hop and rap and the current pop environment, it's not about selling out, it's about cashing in, which is a completely different thing. And that is leading to, again, this braggadociousness, which is an essential part of this music.
Well, I also think it has to do with the fact that if you actually go back to the roots of hip hop, everybody would, and I'm sure Aaron can speak to this, it was a part of creating music that I'm from the Bronx, I'm from Atlanta, I'm from Texas. So I think that now that the music, it's always been weaved into the fabric since day one in the culture of the music. So now that we actually have our own Canadian
what neighborhood
stars,
were you from? What city were you from?
that was always a part of the music from 30 years ago until this day. And so our stars being from this space, because you don't see Alessia Cara saying, hey, I'm Canadian in every song, but if you have people that are from a genre where it's important to, represent your culture, to bring your culture to the forefront, that is always what hip hop has done from day one.
You don't see it with The Weeknd, you don't see it with Alyssa Carrier, you don't see it with Justin Bieber. You do see it with Drake.
Yeah.
He has, been the city's greatest ambassador.
The country's
greatest ambassador since, I don't know who.
Yeah.
Now you've worked with Drake, have you not?
I have had the opportunity to say that, yes.
And okay, so for my generation, help explain how he put Toronto on the map.
Well, I think that in so many ways, from just one, he's an incredible writer, and people in the industry love him for his writing, and so he's done a lot for other artists. He has really openly claimed Toronto. A lot of stars and a lot of people, when they work in entertainment from Canada, go and live in LA, they go and live in New York. Drake is here over the summer playing volleyball with his friends, up by Yorkdale, or, he's created things in Toronto like OVO Bounce, OVO Fest. He's done so many things to bring back.
He's got that nice crib on the bridal path.
I was just going to say, he's created a lot of jobs up there, too.
Exactly, he built his home in Toronto.
Go ahead, John.
Moreover, he's also done this. Moreover, he's also done the summit. He's made Toronto and the idea of Toronto an important part of his music and his global brand.
Well, and I guess, Aaron, the whole Raptors thing too has just he's so closely associated with Toronto Raptors basketball,
Right.
And that's international now.
Absolutely. I think there's one missing element from this, this narrative is that rap has never been seen as a profitable genre in Canada. So to have somebody like Drake and to have the producers that he works with and to have artists like Murda Beats, all these artists that are coming up and making this international money for us, and to say, I am Canadian, that's something that's so important. And that's something that has allowed the industry at large in Canada to start recognizing us and start accepting that, hip hop is pop music. And it is an important genre for the entire industry to start paying attention to.
Let me quote something here from an article that John wrote a few years ago. Since log drivers first waltzed, Canada's cultural output has been saddled with a reputation for being the uncool, kooky cousin of its neighbors to the south, especially when it came to the performing arts. Being from Canada was a novelty best explored in warmer climates and cooler locales of Hollywood or Laurel Canyon. Shania and Celine may have dominated the charts in the 90s, and Rush may be one of the most successful bands in the history of rock, but no amount of slapping da bass could make Geddy Lee hip or tragically or otherwise. That all changed in 2015. To paraphrase The Guardian, we've now found ourselves in the midst of a cultural awakening, the rise of cool Canadiana. For the first time since maybe ever, Canadian pop artists are proud to be from Canada. The result is a new class of rappers, singers, and former Degrassi stars who would rather run through the 6 with their woes than move to New York or Los Angeles to make it. Okay, John, follow up on that's a very nice turn of phrase. You had people in the studio here smiling at your turn of phrases there, but follow up. What else are you trying to say there?
Well, I wrote that in 2015, just for context. Well, basically, well, I mean, I left most of it what I wanted to say on the page, which was that there was this idea that Canada wasn't cool, you know, in the both pejorative and literal sense. It was a cold climate place where people didn't. I mean, I think somebody else brought this up earlier. It wasn't hip to stay in Canada, and now things are different. You know, it's people are moving to Toronto. People are staying in Toronto. Unlike somebody like Neil Young or Joni Mitchell, who had to go to California to kind of find their muse and find their financial legs, Drake has stayed in Toronto. Bieber, perhaps less so, but he still has a house in and around Toronto. Right. Alyssa Cara still has all these people, but Shawn Mendes walks his dog downtown. If you're ever around there, these artists are still considered Toronto home and are proud of it. You know, and in a world where you're constantly telling people where you are and what you're doing, it's nice to say, hey, these guys are actually from Toronto. It's not like Neil Young, who's trying to get a American citizenship now, for example.
I think the bigger impact that Drake actually had, and we always talk about the artist, is actually the industry. You know, Drake's lawyer, Chris Taylor, his firm has increased its value. You know, all of the other people surrounding it, from, you know, Ahmed, who now runs House with Lamar. There's so many other extensions that have developed the industry here, why I think people are able to stay here and why people are attracted. LeBron wants to come and watch OVO Bound. So, you know, we're always talking about artists, and I think that's where we get a little bit lost in Canada, is yes, our artists are doing really well, but the peripherals, the people who support the industry have actually grown their my brand has been more established because of the people who continue to work in this space. So,
does anybody have a last name anymore? all the people you just mentioned have only got one name.
I only got one name too, so, you know, but yeah.
Alan, you wanted to say.
Yeah, there has been a problem up until recently where Canadian record labels can't break an artist internationally. They have to go and use the resources of their American parent company, which is why you have somebody like Justin Bieber living in Calabasas in California. It's why you have Drake going down to the U.S., why you have The Weeknd having a very nice penthouse in New York City these days. In order to break it internationally, it's very difficult to do it from a Canadian base. I think only maybe Celine Dion is the only one that managed to do it. Everybody else has had to go to America while still maintaining their Canadian roots and their Canadian identity. We've had to send them to the U.S. in order to have that big breakthrough, simply because they have the resources and the reach.
John, in your view, does mentioning Canadiana or that you're from Canada now, does it actually help sell records?
In a certain genre, sure. And that speaks to, I believe, what Rook said earlier, which is that now Canada has the proper infrastructure and has the sound, so to speak. So again, you have to look to the producers more than the artists on that one. But now when you say you're from Toronto, people are like, oh, that's where Drake's from, or I mean, less so where the Weeknd's from. But in general, you know, the calling card of being from Toronto, and unfortunately it is very specific to Toronto, not Vancouver, or unless you're in indie rock, Montreal. Toronto itself is kind of a hip city. I think there was a statistic that Drake brought personally, or his brand, brought, I think, like 9% of tourism dollars to Toronto last year, a couple years ago. But anyways, that idea that people are coming to Toronto rather than leaving is something new and very exciting for, I'm sure, everybody on the panel.
You know, what we're seeing today is actually the result of 40 years, more than 40 years worth of development. Back before the CanCon regulations came into effect in 1971, we didn't have a Canadian music industry. We needed to have this industrial strategy that would not only support Canadians on the radio, but recording studios, managers, venues, agents, promoters, everything that you would need for a first world music industry. And for the first 15 or 20 years, it was pretty awful.
Can I follow up on that for a second, Alan? Because when Gino Vanelli sang "When I Think About Those Nights in Montreal," that's the first time
the first time I'd ever heard about it.
Exactly.
Too, yeah.
It's the first time I ever recall a Canadian artist mentioning right out there in the lyrics that they were Canadian. Before that, was it considered too uncool to do that?
It was. I mean, you would get play, you know, actually, no, Neil Young would have talked about a place in Northern Ontario. in one of his early songs. But at the same time,
and Joni Mitchell and the Guess Who, I believe, also.
well, running back to Saskatoon.
Yeah, but
And Portage and Maine.
exactly.
But I'd have to disagree a little bit with what CanCon brings to the table in terms of what's happening right now in that 40-year history. When I go into the States and the amount of radio stations in New York alone that are urban music stations, there's 10 powerful urban music stations, and we have a commercial 2 urban station here that's playing Drake maybe once every 6 hours, whereas Power 97, all these radio stations are playing urban music nonstop. I hear more Canadian content in America than I do actually here in the radio when we're talking specifically to the genre that is dominating the music industry internationally right now. So if CanCon is a part of what's creating that opportunity, and I'm sure Aaron can echo that in our genre specifically, you're not going to go through the radio and hear Party Next Door's latest single. You're not going to hear all of the artists that are big online that can go to the States and tour on radio here or on TV here or in placements on Canadian television here. So I can't specifically say that CanCon is keeping this genre bolstering or growing.
No, but
or
it wouldn't
alive.
exist the way it does today had it not been 40 years of Canadian content regulations making sure that people, create the infrastructure
But if
that's
the music
required.
that is booming right now doesn't play on Canadian...
No, but that's not my point. But that music wouldn't exist. They wouldn't have the infrastructure to create that music to go elsewhere if that infrastructure had not been laid over the past 45 years.
Aaron, you want to come in, break this tie?
To a degree. When we look at the Canadian music industry, the infrastructure has never allowed Black artists, Indigenous artists to thrive. So we are looking at this industry from a standpoint of the past 10 years, and that has allowed, hip hop to suddenly rise to the capacity that it has. But in a grand scheme of things, Rooks is right. Like, we don't have enough support in this country right now for this genre.
Define support.
Support in terms of financial support. We don't have
Wait, we have
support.
Factor, we have
Yeah, but that has
Starmaker, we
been-
have...
Look at who gets Star Maker and Factor.
Right.
You can't look at Drake.
Sorry,
You
just
can't-
tell me what's Factor and
So
Star
Factor
Maker?
is a shout out Factor. I love Factor. I'm a jury member.
Right.
Proud of Factor. But when we look at all the government bodies that fund music and fund music companies and fund recording studios and fund music videos, urban music is not.
But this is all based on writing grants and applying for these
Right,
things.
but then you have to look at the language that's in those grants, and it's disproportionate. If I don't have a post-secondary education, I can't understand that grant. And that's something that
Well,
has
I'll tell you,
targeted.
anybody who does get a grant has to get a grant writer to do that.
But that also comes down to money. We don't have $300 to give to anybody to just, pass off to
But
write a grant that we might get back.
Even
right?
beyond that, though, beyond the grant and who can afford it and who can't afford it, if we look at the grant and the funders, because you have to say, how many of the #1 stars have any of the grant systems been able to say that they personally like?
All of them. I mean, there are record labels right now. The big major record
For sure,
labels
they get their
have
fans,
grant
yeah.
writers who are actually writing grants on behalf of the artists that they have on their roster.
Absolutely, but if I am an 18-year-old kid and I'm coming from a underserved community, I don't have money to give to a grant writer to write that grant. So that's an
And you also just said the
entire-
big record labels. The big record labels
Right.
aren't looking at.
Let me
urban
get
music
John
in
on this.
Canada.
John, what's just back to the original argument. What's your view on whether or not people like The Weeknd or Drake, Alessia Cara, whether they could have had the success they have today if not for an industry that had been incubated by CanCon regulations going back to the 1970s?
So not to be kind of a fence straddler, but I agree with both of you guys. I think that, to Alan's point, you have to create that infrastructure, and the infrastructure was 100% created by those CanCon rules. When you listen to an artist that was from Canada before the CanCon rules, they just sounded off on the radio, so they had to kind of come up to meet each other. On the other hand, as a result of that, you have a certain gatekeeper, which doesn't allow for certain genre-based artists to, the playing field on that was not even. So I agree with both of you. I think that ultimately the CanCon rules helped Canada establish a culture, but perhaps that culture needs to be revamped.
But Aaron, we're almost in a boundaryless or borderless world today when it comes to music. The signals fly all over the place.
Right.
The internet has, some people would argue the internet has made CanCon or the CRTC or these kinds of regulators irrelevant nowadays.
Right.
So is this kind of thing still important?
I mean, it's still important, for sure. It's still important. It still gives us an upper hand to as Canadian artists, as a Canadian industry to be heard. But when we have, streaming now, when we have, platforms that you don't necessarily are not regulated by CanCon, how does that play into our world today? And how does that leverage Canadian artists when you still have CanCon, but you have a bigger platform when you are able to just occupy this space that is not regulated?
Are you saying we should get rid of Canadian content regs altogether?
I'm saying that it might have to be updated to 2020 in the digital space.
Oh,
Yeah,
it
I agree
definitely does.
100%. Like, I think that one of the challenges, Netflix came into our market and they don't have to apply by the CanCon rules, right? And so when you have Netflix that's making so much money in the Canadian entertainment industry and they're not having to make sure that their songs are, I think that CanCon is an important piece of making sure that we are able to compete with 330 million people south of us for a 31 million population. But we need to make sure that we're going in that digital space. We're making sure that Apple playlists represent us, Spotify playlists represent us. Any digital streaming platform in Canada from film, TV, and music that wants to exist needs to abide by the CanCon rules.
Let me get Aaron on this, just so I can better understand this. We do have a finite pool of money to invest in this.
Right.
Is it better to try to give it directly to artists to create stars, or is it better to put it towards a system that theoretically will just allow those who are the best to rise to the top?
I mean, realistically, it's better to give it to artists directly and allow them to manage what they do with that. Not to say it has to go to every artist, but those who can actually have a business plan ready, who know what they're doing, who are already, trudging the lines of the States and here, who are export ready. I think we need to start giving money to people who are export ready before we start losing our artists, which we have time and time again. We lose them to the States, we lose them to Europe, and then eventually they come home and they're still not recognized. I was looking at the Canadian Hall of Fame and who's in it the other day, and of the 59 inductees, there's only one Black person, there's only one Cree person, there's only one brown person. So why can we not recognize our own, both in funding and both in general excitement for being a Canadian artist?
I think John spoke to something that really important of like the changing of the guard. And, we all have our perspectives and, I feel really lucky to be able to sit at this table. But one of the biggest things that I think that Canada needs to recognize is that, immigrants, I'm a first generation Canadian. Immigrants are the people who are making the music industry what it is right now in Canada. And they often have been outside of this system that works. I can work all over the world and I'm still not recognized very much so in Canada for the work that I do.
That is not a new phenomenon of a Canadian artist being better recognized outside the country than inside the country.
That goes back.
That goes back 150
decades,
years.
yeah.
Sure.
100%.
But especially for first generation kids and immigrants, it's even a harder system to crack.
John, when it comes to producing internationally successful artists who are from this country, some would argue we're in the midst of a golden age of Canadian music right now. Are you on that page?
100%. I think that we are. The fact that we're sitting here having this discussion kind of is an offshoot of that idea, of that, to misquote The Guardian as I did in 2015, that kind of cool Canadiana, the belief that we can exist alongside Americans and the UK in terms of our production. That should indicate that a change of the guard is needed. The gatekeepers need to be changed to recalibrate what Canadian output is and what we should be funding in this country.
But there's all kinds of market forces at work here. There's all kinds of demographic forces. There are all kinds of ethnographic forces that are working. It's an evolving situation. Canadian music really started to come into its own with the rise of can rock in the 1990s, and that's when this nationalistic thing began to take hold, where people demanding Canadian music from Canadian artists and supporting them both by buying records and going to shows. That was the beginning of that groundswell of pride in Canadian stuff. Begins with the Tragically Hip, really, and moves forward. Now, with the changing face of the Canadian population, it's going to evolve. It's going to change into something else. In most parts of the world, rock and roll is not the cultural driver it used to be. In the United States, hip hop and rap is definitely the #1 music. Rock, if you look at the numbers, is still leading in Canada, but hip hop and rap is coming up right behind it.
And country.
And country, ebbs and flows right now. And there's a big issue about women in country right now. They're being so terribly underrepresented.
Absolutely.
But as a nation of 36 million people, we have long punched above our weight on the national stage,
100%.
international stage. And we're the number 5 or number 6 in the world in terms of the music market, depending on what happens with Australia in any given year. And we're going to, you know, if our ethnographic, demographic makeup demands that we change into something else, it'll change.
But I mean, I'm assuming that guys who are closer to our age are more into the rock and roll,
Mostly.
and people who are closer to these two age, they're into the new stuff.
Yep, pretty much.
You know, I grew up in Canada. One of my favorite things about being from Toronto is that I got to listen to Alanis Morissette. I got to listen to Billy Talent. I got to listen to Nickelback. And I also got to listen to, you know, Cardinal Official and Julie Black and all of these other people. I think the biggest challenge we're having right now is just the fact that the Guard doesn't, I love sitting here next to Alan because I've been on panels with him before, and sitting here, it's about merging everything that's happening. It's about having the perspectives come together so that we can create a better economy for artists in Canada, because the other piece of this is audience development. And if we don't have a shared audience, and like when you go to the States and you look at who's in a concert at any given time, especially in urban music, it's so mixed. And so I think that us making sure that we are getting together, that we're having these conversations, and we're sitting down at tables like this to share perspective, this is how we start to, I don't want to change the Guard, let's join forces and make sure that we're building a stronger Canada.
With a minute to go here, John, let me throw the last question to you, and that is, you worked with the CBC, I gather, to help produce that Tragically Hip's last concert, which was so iconic for so many people. I wanted to ask you, from what I hear, your girlfriend had something to say about those efforts. What did she say?
Well, we were sitting in the cinema at CBC and watching the last concert. She just said, you know, it's very, you're part of something special, and it was something special. It united a country in trying to find its identity. And I think, to Alan's point earlier, Gord saw that as a good platform to talk about Indigenous issues. And to Rooks's point, I think the kind of melding of the Guard is, for that to happen, you need the old Guard to recognize that it needs to be melded. And Gord did a good job of that. I'm not the world's biggest Tragically Hip fan by any stretch of the imagination, but you have to applaud his efforts there.
That's John Deckel, freelance journalist, coming to us tonight from New York City. John, thanks for being there in the Big Apple for us. Aaron Ashley, Alan Cross, Kiana Eastman, so great to have you here in our studio in Toronto.
Thank you.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.